Hello, my name is John Montopoli. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I serve on the board of the National Social Anxiety Center, representing the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm also the founder and director of Pacific Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, a group psychotherapy practice located in San Francisco. Thank you for watching this second video. In the first video, I provided you with some basic information about public speaking anxiety, or as it's also known, glossophobia. So you learned things such as public speaking anxiety is the fear of negative evaluation, of being judged, and of ultimately being rejected and loss of social status. You learned that it could happen in both professional and social settings. It could happen in formal and informal. It affects us in many ways, including how we think about things, racing thoughts. It affects our body and our emotions. So we may have increased heart rate, sweating. And it also affects our behavior, so what we do in terms of like avoidance or using safety behaviors. And it may also affect our ability to think clearly and speak eloquently. The consequences of not overcoming this can be quite severe in terms of limiting having the type of life that is most important to us. And we know that there are a variety of causes, including our life experiences, including trauma, our genetics, as well as our belief systems around perfectionism and the expectations that we put on ourselves and how we perform in different situations. In this video, I'm going to highlight some of the tools and techniques that you can use to help yourself overcome public speaking anxiety. I'm going to draw from an area of psychology and psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT has been widely studied and researched as one of the most effective techniques that we can use to help people overcome the fear of speaking in public. The basic principle of CBT is that situations affect the way that we feel, the way that we think, and the way that we behave. We're very interested in understanding the relationship between these different components, the relationship between events, thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Let me provide you with an example. Imagine that you received an email from a company that you have interviewed with and were really hoping to get a job with, and that you got the job. That's great news, right? So perhaps you might have some thoughts that, wow, they really value my experience. They were impressed with my interviews. They think I'll be a good contribution to the company. They really liked me. So those are the thoughts that we experience from the situation of receiving the email. What emotions might you feel? Well, emotions may include feeling happy, feeling excited, feeling perhaps even a little bit of anticipation and a little bit of nervousness. But generally, the feeling is very positive. It's very uplifting, happy, excited. What behaviors might we engage in? So the behaviors that we might engage in might include jumping up and down, feeling a lightness in our bodies, telling friends about the job that we got, maybe even starting to prepare for the job, celebrating. So you can see from this example how that particular event really kind of interrelates to how we think about it, what we do, and how we feel, and also what happens in our bodies, our physical responses. So that's a positive example. We can also see how an event, such as giving a talk in front of a group of people, might activate a whole different sort of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So being told that by your boss that you're going to give a talk to the whole team in 2 days' time might evoke certain thoughts like, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to fail. People are going to judge me. I can't do this. The emotions that one might feel could include anxiety, nervousness, panic, fear. So those we would generally consider negative emotions. What behaviors might we engage in? Behaviors could include trying to avoid it, looking for ways to get somebody else to do it, thinking of ways that you might be able to call on others to take it over for you, or finding some of the behaviors that we might engage in could include avoidance. So how can we avoid it? What can we do to get somebody else to do it? Oh, I'm going to call in sick that day. Other behaviors that we might engage in could include over-preparing. So really kind of rehearsing it over and over and over again, memorizing it. We might engage in other safety behaviors, such as taking anti-anxiety medication or a beta blocker that might reduce the physical reaction, and perhaps we're worried that others will see your hands shaking or your voice quivering. Beta blockers in some cases can help people with those physical responses. Maybe you choose to wear a turtleneck or a scarf if you're worried that your neck is going to turn red. You may call on behaviors that will help you get through the experience if you can't avoid it. So again, we're looking at how these different components interact, and so they form a cycle, and that cycle feeds on itself. The anxiety that we anticipate it happening could affect our physical responses. And then our thoughts will be, oh my gosh, look, I can't do this because I am perspiring or I'm sweating profusely. In order to overcome public speaking anxiety, we believe that we not only need to understand how these different components interact, but we also must have different experiences. We have to change our beliefs and change our behaviors in order to produce a different outcome. One of the most powerful tools that we can use is something called exposure therapy. Some people also call it behavioral experiments. For our purposes here today, we'll call it exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is aimed at systematically putting ourselves in the situations that we avoid so that we can collect new information. So avoidance, while it may seem initially like a relief, I got out of the situation, I don't have to do it, and you experience a rapid decrease in the discomfort you're experiencing. But what is the downside of avoidance? The downside of avoidance is it doesn't allow us to test out the beliefs that we have. It also doesn't allow us to see that if our beliefs come true, that we can find a way of overcoming that, of dealing with it, of maybe it's not so bad. I'm going to walk you through you setting up some exposures for yourself to overcome this fear of public speaking. So start off by taking out a piece of paper, and I'm going to ask you to brainstorm situations that involve public speaking that you either currently avoid but experience some discomfort and would avoid if you have the opportunity to. So list out about 5 or 8 of those situations. Some of those might include attending a lunch with friends, knowing that you just came back from a trip. They may ask you to, tell us some stories about that. That's a public speaking situation. So you may include that. Other situations might include giving weekly updates at staff meetings, answering questions in a group setting, taking a class and having to give a presentation. Or it might even include giving the best man speech or a speech at an important event. So list out about 5 or 8 of those situations and rank them from easiest to hardest. Once you've done that, we're going to do some prep work before we actually do the exposure. So on that same piece of paper, pick the situation that was the easiest. So let's say it is, I'm going to this event for lunch, and I'm going to voluntarily tell my friends about my trip. So that's the situation. Now list out the things that you're most worried about would happen. So that might include all of these eyes will be looking at me. When they do, I will feel nervous and my mind will go blank. Or it will be totally uninteresting and boring and people will look away and not want to talk to me anymore. Okay, so those are some general fears and thoughts, but let's see if we can get to what is the most important fear. So the most important fear might be, I'm worried that what I say will be incoherent and uninteresting. Next, rate how likely you think that is to happen. 0 would be not at all, and 100 would be it's absolutely going to happen. 100% chance that I am going to be incoherent and uninteresting. Next, we're going to come up with some behavioral objectives. So behavioral objectives are goals that we're setting for ourselves during the exposure. So examples of goals might be, I'm going to wait for a time during the lunch conversation and I'm going to say, hey guys, I just got back from a trip to Hawaii and I'd like to tell you about it. So that would be a behavioral goal or a behavioral objective. Next, some other behavioral objectives might include, I'm going to attempt to make eye contact with as much of the audience as I can. Another objective will be, I'm going to make sure that I pause between sentences and take a breath. Another objective could be, I'm going to try to elaborate on some of the points. So rather than rushing through it, I'm going to leisurely talk about 1 or 2 experiences of my trip. So those are some really concrete goals that you're working on achieving during this exposure. You may also want to identify 1 or 2 safety behaviors that you may use typically and try not to do that safety behavior. So one of the safety behaviors that is very common is to speed up our talk. Now that you've identified the worst, the thing that you're most worried about will happen, and your behavioral objectives, it's time to actually attempt the exposure. And as you're going into the exposure, I'd like to ask you to try to have an open and curious stance as you're going into this exposure. So rather than viewing it as what the outcome is, view it as, this is something that I want to learn how to do better. Or perhaps it's, I want to go in an open mind, and this is an opportunity for me to learn how I can improve in this particular situation. So again, enter into the exposure with willingness, an open mind, and curiosity. After the exposure, you're going to come back to the piece of paper where you wrote out the worst case fear, what you're most worried about, and your behavioral objectives. Start off by putting a check mark next to all of the behavioral objectives that you accomplished. And if you did not accomplish any of those, put a question mark next to that and come back to it later, but you're going to ask yourself, honestly, what was it that got in the way of you achieving that objective? Next, you're going to look at the thing that you were most worried about happening. In this case, it was, I'll be incoherent and uninteresting. Seriously and objectively answer the question, was I incoherent and was I uninteresting? We tend to be quite critical of our performance, so I'm really going to ask you to pay attention to looking for opportunities where both positive and maybe some negative things occurred. We want to be extremely objective, but looking at all of the possibilities. So in terms of the question of, was I incoherent and uninteresting, look for examples of how you may have been more interesting. And that might be, people seemed to be nodding as I was talking, or people smiled, and my friend Jamie asked me a question about the trip. And in terms of the areas to improve, identify, maybe I did jump around a little bit, but didn't seem like other people really paid much mind to it. So while we want to identify the areas to continue to work on, we also want to try to see it in a more objective lens. Finally, as we debrief the exposure, I'd like to ask you to answer a few questions. What conclusions can I draw from having engaged in this experience? So conclusions might include something like, it went better than I thought. Some people seemed interesting. Some people seemed interested. I'd like to ask you to answer two questions as you continue the debriefing. First question is, what can I conclude from this experience? What is the summary? An example of the summary might be, it went probably better than I thought. Some people seemed interested. I seemed a little scattered in my thoughts, but generally it was a positive experience. Ask yourself, what can you do the next time you encounter the same exposure? some conclusions that you might come to are I could speak a little bit more slowly. I can, be more expressive in how I speak. Speak more loudly is perhaps another conclusion that you can draw and take to you to the next experience. Debriefing the exposure is extremely, extremely important as we do work to help ourselves overcome public speaking anxiety, because it allows us to identify our fears and to get new information that provides us a more balanced view of these long-held beliefs about what the worst thing could happen. It's important as you begin to work on this public speaking anxiety to get lots of repetition, to look for opportunities, to lean into opportunities where you can be a researcher and experiment with your beliefs. There's a variety of ways that you can think about doing that. You could join a self-help group where peers help work with each other and give feedback on public speaking roles. Now that you've accomplished your first exposure, it's important to do it over again. Repetition is extremely important in exposure therapy. Repetition allows us to solidify the change in beliefs by providing us with more information. Again, exposure therapy is basically an opportunity to be very curious and to be a researcher on our thoughts. So repetition, extremely important. Doing the debriefing, extremely important in order to really consolidate what you learned from the exposure. Again, repetition is very important. It requires a little bit of creativity to come up with some exposures that you can continue to test out your beliefs. Some of the situations that you may consider is joining a peer-led group of others who are looking to improve their public speaking skills. Virtual reality can provide an immersive experience where you may feel like you're actually in the situation that you are most fearful of, and you can practice managing your anxiety, testing out your beliefs, practicing your public speaking skills, the words that you use, how you use the words. Virtual reality is becoming a more common tool that will be available and is available to use in overcoming this fear. You could also assemble a group of friends or family members to practice giving a speech that you're preparing to give in person. Take an acting class or an improv class. Take a language class. Language class, you'll be required to speak when the teacher asks you questions in the target language. Identify videos online where you will be in front of an audience speaking to a video of people in the audience. And lastly, taking a speech class or a public speaking class at a community college can also be another way of further advancing both improving your communication skills, but also an opportunity for you to do exposure therapy. Earlier, I mentioned the list of situations starting from the easiest to the hardest. You don't need to go in a hierarchical fashion from easiest to hardest. However, it's important to have that as a rough road map or a rough blueprint of the things that you're going to be aiming to do exposure therapy with. Finally, public speaking anxiety can interfere with having the kind of life and the things in life that you would like to have. It doesn't have to be that way. Many people overcome their fear of public speaking with practice, with identifying your thoughts and testing out those thoughts and getting new information to invalidate those thoughts is a way for you to also overcome this. Practice is super important. I know that you can do it too. Good luck.